In today's video, a 39-year-old German mountaineer becomes only the fourth woman in history to stand on the summit of Mount Everest, then dies on the descent the next morning above Camp 4, and for the next 13 years her body sits frozen against her backpack in a sitting position with her eyes open and her hair moving in each gust of wind, exactly 100 meters above the South Col. On the standard line, every climber on the southern route has to walk past to attempt the summit. The Sherpa who tried to keep her alive that night would survive 5 Everest summits in his career and lose all his toes to the cold he absorbed staying with her. It was October 2nd, 1979. The mountain was Everest. The expedition was led by her own husband, Gerhard Schmatz, a 50-year-old German notary who had become, the day before, the oldest man ever to summit Everest. The route was the South Col Southeast Ridge, the standard line first climbed in 1953 by Hillary and Tenzing. Hannelore Schmatz, born Letterman on February 14, 1940, had married Gerhard in 1962. She had climbed Manaslu in 1973, Tirish Mir in 1975, Lhotse in 1977. She had organized every expedition's logistics herself, every load list, every supply order, every customs declaration. Her husband called her an absolute genius at procuring and transporting expedition supplies. He meant it. Without her, none of his summits would have happened. The team in 1979 numbered 8 climbers and 5 Sherpas. Hannelore was the only woman. Among the climbers was Ray Genet, the Swiss-American legend of Alaska, known across 2 continents as Pirate Genet, the man who had made the first winter ascent of Denali in 1967 and led more clients up that mountain than any guide alive. Genet had never climbed above 8,000 meters. Denali tops out at 6,194. Everest is a different ocean entirely. The physiology that had carried Genet through 40 below temperatures on the Kahiltna Glacier was the same physiology that would collapse at 8,400 meters, where the available oxygen drops to roughly a third of what the body draws at sea level. The team also included New Zealander Nick Banks, Swiss-American climber Hans von Kannel, and German alpinists Tilman Fischbach, Günter Kampfe, and Hermann Worth. Pertemba Sherpa, Lakpa, Gyalu Sherpa, Sungdare Sherpa, and Ang Jangbu Sherpa carried the loads through the icefall. Sungdare and Ang Jangbu would be the ones who watched her death. The expedition reached the South Col on September 24th. Then a multi-day blizzard pinned them at Camp 3 and forced retreat back down. They reorganized. They split into 2 summit teams. Gerhard's group went first. He, Hermann Worth, Hans von Kannel, Pertemba Sherpa, and Lakpa Gyalu left South Col at 5:45 a.m. on October 1st. They summited around 2 p.m. in cloudy but manageable soft snow conditions. They were back at South Col by 7 p.m. after dark. Gerhard's altimeter recorded a successful round trip. He radioed his wife at the col below and told her the weather was deteriorating and she should consider calling off her own summit attempt the next morning. Hannelore was indignant. She had carried this expedition's logistics for 2 years. The route was right there above her. At 5 a.m. on October 2nd, Hannelore Genet, Tilman Fischbach, Nick Banks, Sungdare Sherpa, and Ang Jangbu Sherpa left the South Current. The wind picked up by 7 a.m. Genet, who had been struggling with the altitude since the previous evening, unropped from the team to slow his own pace against the protests of the Sherpas. He fell behind. The leading climbers reached the summit between 1 p.m. and 1:30 p.m. Hannelore Schmatz stood on the top of the world. She was the 4th woman in history to reach that point, after Junko Tabei in May 1975, Fantog of China in May 1975, and Wanda Rutkiewicz of Poland in October 1978. She had less than an hour of viable descent window before the wind turned the upper mountain into a hypothermia chamber. She did not turn around in time. The summit photographs Gerhard later developed from her camera show her smiling. The descent began near 2 p.m. The leading climbers reached the former ridge campsite at 8,350 meters by 5 p.m. They could see and hear the last group, Hannelore Genet, and Sung Dare, still descending the steep section below the south summit. At the base of that section, Genet's supplemental oxygen ran out. He refused to continue. He insisted on bivouacking for the night, right there, in the death zone, with no tent, no stove, no fuel for melting snow, no shelter beyond what they could dig with their hands in the soft, fresh snow. The second party had nothing to melt water with. They had no way to make a hot drink. They had no way to warm their hands. The 1979 oxygen apparatus they had been using offered no buffer reserve. When the bottle ran out, the bottle ran out. There was no second supply on a Sherpa's back. There was no Vicks cache higher up. There was only what they had carried, and what they had carried was finished. Sungdar Sherpa argued. Angjangbu Sherpa argued. They had been hired specifically for this expedition because they had survived deep cold before, on Manaslu, on Annapurna, on Dholagiri. They knew what happened to the human body in the death zone overnight without supplemental oxygen and without shelter. They had carried bodies out of similar situations on lower peaks. Genet did not move. Hannelore, exhausted, sat down beside him. Sungdare stayed with them both. Angjangbu, under instructions from the team, radio relayed up from the South Col, descended alone to bring word to Camp 4. The decision to bivouac at 8,400 meters with no equipment was, by every standard the Himalayan database has tracked since, an unrecoverable error. The mountain would decide the rest. The wind that night across the Lhotse face was, by the Schmatz expedition log entries, sustained gale force. Air temperature at 8,400 meters dropped below negative 40 degrees Celsius. Wind chill is irrelevant at those numbers. Cells freeze. Tissue dies in measurable minutes. Genet, frostbitten and depleted, died of exposure sometime in the early hours of October 3rd. The exact time was not recorded by anyone present. Sungdare and Hannelore survived the night through some combination of will, oxygen rationing, and the fact that they had each other to share warmth with. On the morning of October 3rd, Sungdare descended a short way down to the ridge campsite and brought additional oxygen back up to Hannelore. The two then began the descent together. They left Genet's body in the snow cave. They were visible from the South Col as they moved down toward the ridge camp. 6 Sherpas had left Camp 3 earlier that morning with oxygen and emergency supplies for a rescue attempt. Ngawang Tenzing Sherpa reached the South Col at 8:30 a.m. and began climbing upward toward Hannelore with Fishbach. They could see her descending in the distance, with Sungdare beside her. They were moving slowly. They were perhaps 100 meters above Camp 4, on the slope just below the ridge, when Hannelore stopped. She sat down against her backpack. She turned to Sungdare. She said water. She said water again. Then she did not say anything else. Her last word was the same word every Sherpa hears as a warning sign on the upper mountain. Water means dehydration. Dehydration at altitude means decision-making is gone. Decision-making gone at 8,400 meters means the climber is no longer going to walk off the mountain. Sungdare tried to lift her. He could not. He stayed with her. He continued giving her oxygen. He stayed with her past the point his own body could afford. He stayed with her until his fingers began to lose sensation and his face turned the white-gray that experienced Sherpas recognize as the line beyond which staying any longer would mean both of them dying on that slope rather than just one. He descended alone to the rescue team coming up. Ngawang Tenzing reached the spot where Hannelore was sitting. She was dead. Sungdare Sherpa would survive. He would summit Everest 5 times across his career, which placed him for a brief period among the most experienced high-altitude Sherpas in the Khumbu. He would lose all his toes to the frostbite he absorbed staying with her through that morning. The amputations were performed in Kathmandu the following winter. He climbed Everest again the next spring. The mountain pays its witnesses in its own currency. Hannelore's body did not move. She was, by accident of geography and weather, positioned at exactly the point on the upper Lhotse face where the southern route line passes most directly. Every expedition that climbed Everest from the south side after October 1979 walked past her. Her body was frozen in a sitting position, leaning against her backpack, with her eyes open and her hair moving in each gust of wind. Her climbing rope, still clipped, held her in place against the gale gusts that swept the ridge through autumn and winter. She sat there through 1980, through 1981, through 1982. Every climber who passed her saw her face. Every climber who passed her saw her hair move. The image entered the published mountaineering literature within 2 seasons. In 1982, an unidentified climber is presumed to have cut her rope. Without the rope, the body began to shift in the wind. The body moved over the next several seasons, slowly migrating across the slope. The Norwegian mountaineer Arne Næss Jr., leading an expedition in the mid-1980s, would write what may be the most quoted description of a body on Everest in all of mountaineering literature. "It feels as if she follows me with her eyes as I pass by," Næss wrote in his expedition log. Approximately 100 meters above Camp 4, she sits leaning against her pack, as if taking a short break. A woman with her eyes wide open and her hair waving in each gust of wind. I cannot escape the sinister guard. The passage would be reprinted in Lene Gammelgaard's account of the 1996 Everest disaster, and from there it would circulate through climbing journalism for decades. Every commercial Everest guide working the south side between 1979 and 1984 had to brief their clients on what they would see at 8,300 meters and prepare them for the moment when they would walk past her. In 1984, after nearly 5 years sitting against her backpack at 8,300 meters, a particularly violent storm pushed her over the edge of the Kangshung face. She slid down the eastern wall of the mountain out of sight, and the wind took the rest. Her body has never been found. The Kangshung face is the most remote of Everest's 3 sides, the side that faces Tibet, the side that no commercial route ever crosses. Wherever she came to rest, no climber has yet passed that way. Her husband Gerhard, who had summited the day before her and survived, would write later in his expedition memoir that the team came home. "But I alone, without my beloved Hannelore." He never returned to Everest. In 1980, traveling through Kathmandu on his way back to Germany from another smaller expedition, Gerhard found a Leica camera for sale at a vendor's stall in the bazaar. He recognized it immediately. The camera was Hannelore's. She had been carrying it the day she summited and the day she died. Gerhard purchased it back for $200 American. He never identified who had taken it from her body on the ridge. He never investigated. He had what he had come for. He kept the camera in his office in New Ulm for the remainder of his life. He never climbed at altitude again. The notary practice continued. The expedition logs were filed. The expedition photographs were filed. The camera sat on a shelf for the next 40 years. It was 20 years before another German woman summited Mount Everest and survived. Helga Henge reached the top in 1999 from the Tibetan side, the north route, the side Hannelore had never climbed. The southern route had by then claimed 3 other German nationals. The Himalayan database lists Hannelore Schmatz as the first woman to die on the upper slopes of Everest and the first German national to die at altitude on the mountain. The list of women who summited Everest before her is short: Tabay, Fantog, Rutkiewicz, then Hannelore. 3 of the 4 came home. In 2009, the Austrian alpinist Billy Bierling deliberately followed Hannelore's exact route from the south to the summit and back in tribute. Bierling came home. What Sungdare Sherpa did on that ridge has never been adequately named in the mountaineering literature. He stayed with her past the point his own body could afford. He kept giving her oxygen past the point his own oxygen was running low. He carried her last word, water, down the mountain. He returned to Everest 5 more times. He climbed Everest itself 5 times. He guided commercial clients to the summit through the corridor where she had died, walking past her body, walking past her every season for years. When the body finally left the ridge in 1984, he had already climbed past her 4 times. Sungdare's career on Everest ended in the late 1980s after a final descent in which he lost the remaining sensation in his feet. The deadliest decision on Everest is not the decision to climb. It is the decision, made in the death zone, with the daylight gone and the oxygen running out, to stop. Hannelore Schmatz had been the fourth woman to summit Everest. She had been an absolute genius at logistics, in her husband's words, the kind of climber who organized the loads for 8 people across 2 months at altitude in the Khumbu. She had walked through the Yellow Band, she had crossed the Geneva Spur, she had stood on the top of the world at 1 p.m. on October 2, 1979. By 6 p.m. that evening, she had agreed to a bivouac that no Sherpa on her team would sign off on. The mountain kept her body in plain view for 13 years. Then the wind took the rest. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen.